Johnny Miller came to the veterinarian in our village from Pinewood Lake and brought a small, warm rabbit wrapped in a tattered cotton jacket. The rabbit was crying and blinking its tear-red eyes a lot. "Are you out of your mind?" shouted the veterinarian. "Soon you'll be dragging mice to me, boy." "Don't swear this is a special rabbit," said Johnny in a hoarse whisper. His grandfather sent him and told him to cure him. "Treat him for what?" "His paws are burned." The vet turned Johnny toward the door, shoved him in the back, and shouted after him, "Go away, go away. I don't know how to treat them. Roast it with onions. It'll be an appetizer for grandfather." Johnny said nothing. He went out onto the porch, blinked his eyes, blew his nose, and stared at the wooden wall. Tears ran down the wall. Rabbit was shivering quietly under his greasy jacket. "What's the matter, boy?" Johnny was asked by Annie's pitiful grandmother. She had brought her only goat to the vet. "Why are you two hardy ones crying? What's the matter?" "He's burned, Grandpa's rabbit," Johnny said quietly. "He burned his paws in the forest fire and he can't run. He's going to die." "He's not going to die, boy," Annie mumbled. "Tell your grandfather if he wants to take the rabbit out, to take it to Dr. Charles Peterson in town." Johnny wiped away his tears and walked through the woods home to Pinewood Lake. He didn't walk, but ran barefoot on the hot, sandy road. A recent forest fire had passed a ways, to the north near the lake itself. It smelled of cinders and dried cloves. It grew in large islands in the glades. The rabbit moaned. Johnny found some fluffy leaves covered with silvery soft hairs along the road, tore them off, put them under a pine tree, and turned the rabbit around. The rabbit looked at the leaves, ducked his head into them, and fell silent. "What are you doing, Gray?" Johnny asked quietly. "You should have eaten." The rabbit was silent. "You ought to eat," Johnny repeated, his voice trembling. "Are you thirsty?" Rabbit wiggled his torn ear and closed his eyes. Johnny took him in his arms and ran straight through the woods to give him a drink from the lake. The heat of that summer was unheard of in the woods. In the morning, a string of white clouds came. At noon, the clouds would rush upward toward the zenith, and before one's eyes, they would drift away and disappear somewhere beyond the boundaries of the sky. The hot wind had been blowing for 2 weeks without respite. The resin flowing down the pine trunks had turned to amber stone. In the morning, Grandpa put on clean socks and new shoes, took his staff and a piece of bread, and walked into town. Johnny carried the rabbit behind him. The rabbit was quiet, only occasionally shuddering and sighing convulsively. The hot wind raised a cloud of dust over the town, soft as flour. Chicken fluff, dry leaves, and straw flew in it. From afar, it seemed as if a silent fire was smoking over the town. The market square was very empty and sultry. The cabmen's horses were dozing near the water pump, with straw hats on their heads. Grandfather crossed himself. "It's either the horse or the bride. The devil knows," he said, and spat. They asked passers-by about Dr. Charles Peterson for a long time, but nobody said anything. They went into a drugstore. A fat old man with glasses and a short white coat shrugged his shoulders angrily and said, "I like that. Quite a strange question. Dr. Charles Peterson is a specialist in children's diseases and has stopped seeing patients for 3 years now. Why do you need him?" Grandfather, stammering with respect for the apothecary and with shyness, told about the rabbit. "I like it," said the pharmacist. "Interesting patients in our town. I like it very much." He nervously took off his glasses, wiped them clean, put them back on his nose, and stared at his grandfather. The grandfather was silent and paused. The apothecary was also silent. The silence was getting heavy. "Post Street 3. Suddenly, the apothecary shouted out in a heartbeat and slammed down a thick, disheveled book. 3. Grandfather and Johnny reached Post Street just in time to see a tall thunderstorm coming up from across the river. A lazy thunder rolled over the horizon as a sleepy strong man straightened his shoulders and shook the ground reluctantly. Gray ripples ran along the water. Silent lightning bolts struck the meadows stealthily, but swiftly and strongly. Far beyond the fields, haystacks lit by them were already burning. Large drops of rain fell on the dusty road, and soon it looked like the surface of the moon. Each drop left a small crater in the dust. Dr. Charles Peterson was playing something sad and melodious on the piano when his grandfather's disheveled beard appeared in the window. In a minute, Dr. Peterson was already angry. "I'm not a veterinarian," he said, and slammed the piano lid shut. Immediately, thunder rumbled in the meadows. "I've spent my life treating children, not rabbits." "A child and a rabbit are the same," Grandfather muttered stubbornly. "It's all the same. Cure it, please. Our veterinarian has no jurisdiction over such cases. He's our cowman. This rabbit, you might say, my savior. I owe him my life. Gratitude must show gratitude. And you say, throw." In another minute, Dr. Peterson, an old man with gray ruffled eyebrows, was listening to his grandfather's stumbling story. Dr. Peterson eventually agreed to treat the rabbit. The next morning, Grandfather left for the lake, and Johnny was left with Dr. Peterson to walk the rabbit. A day later, the whole of Post Street, overgrown with grass, already knew that Dr. Peterson was treating a rabbit that had been burned in a terrible forest fire and had saved some old man. 2 days later, the whole small town knew about it, and on the third day, a long young man in a fedora came to Dr. Peterson, called himself an employee of a New York newspaper, and asked for an interview about the rabbit. The rabbit was cured. Johnny wrapped it in a cotton rag and carried it home. Soon the story about the rabbit was forgotten, and only some professor long sought his grandfather to sell him the rabbit. He even sent letters with stamps for an answer. But Grandpa wouldn't give up. At his dictation, Johnny wrote a letter to the professor. "The rabbit is not for sale. It's a living soul. Let it live in the wild. Hereby remain Larry Miller. This fall, I spent the night at Larry's grandfather's place on Pinewood Lake. The constellations, cold as grains of ice, floated in the water. Dry reeds rustled. The ducks shivered in the thickets and quacked pitifully all night. Grandfather did not sleep. He sat by the stove and mended a torn fishing net. Then he put the kettle on. It made the windows in the hut fog up at once, and the stars turned from fiery points into cloudy balls. Murzik barked in the yard. He jumped into the darkness, bared his teeth, and bounced away. He fought with the impenetrable October night. The rabbit slept on the porch and occasionally knocked loudly on the rotten floorboards with his hind paw in his sleep. We drank tea at night, waiting for the distant and hesitant dawn, and over tea my grandfather finally told me the story of the rabbit. In August, my grandfather went hunting on the northern shore of the lake. The woods were as dry as gunpowder. Grandpa came across a rabbit with a torn left ear. Grandpa shot it with an old wire-bound shotgun, but missed. The rabbit ran away. The grandfather went on his way, but suddenly he became alarmed. From the south, from the side of the Lopakovi Hills, there was a strong smell of smoke. The wind had picked up. The smoke grew thicker. It was already carrying a white veil through the forest, covering the bushes. It became difficult to breathe. Grandfather realized that a forest fire had started, and the fire was coming straight at him. The wind turned into a hurricane. The fire raced across the ground at an unheard-of speed. According to Grandfather, even a train could not escape such a fire. Grandpa was right. The fire was traveling at 30 miles an hour during the hurricane. Grandfather was running over bumps, stumbling, falling, smoke eating out his eyes, and the wide rumble and crackle of flames could already be heard behind him. Death overtook Grandfather, grabbed him by the shoulders, and at that time a rabbit jumped out from under Grandfather's feet. It ran slowly and dragged its hind legs. Then only Grandfather noticed that the rabbit's hind legs were burned. Grandfather was happy to see the rabbit as if it were his own. As an old forest dweller, Grandpa knew that animals can smell where the fire is coming from much better than humans, and always escape. They die only in those rare cases when the fire surrounds them. The grandfather ran after the rabbit. He ran, crying with fear and shouting, "Wait, dear. Don't run so fast." The rabbit led the grandfather out of the fire. When they ran out of the forest to the lake, the rabbit and the grandfather both collapsed from exhaustion. The grandfather picked up the rabbit and carried it home. The rabbit's hind legs and belly were scorched. Then Grandpa fixed it up and kept it. "Yes," said the grandfather, looking at the kettle angrily, as if the kettle was to blame. "Yes, and in front of that rabbit, it turns out that I have done something wrong. Dear man, what have you done wrong? Go out and look at the rabbit, my savior, and then you'll know. Get the lantern." I took the lantern from the table and went out on the porch. The rabbit was asleep. I bent over him with the lantern and noticed that the rabbit's left ear was torn. That's when I realized everything.